Well, good morning. Hope you're having a wonderful week. It's Wednesday where I am. Down in Australia, it's Winter Wednesday. Okay, all you woodworking gurus, we're ready to start building Antonio's shoe shine box. Antonio, I hope you're ready. Let's get started. These are the two 1x6 boards I picked out, and I wanted to point out that they're not perfectly flat, and that's pretty common. Actually, these are the straightest that I could find. This one has kind of a curve going that way. If you have a board that's bending in that direction, it's not really as bad as if it were bending in this direction. But anyways, I want to show you a couple of techniques that we can glue these together even if the boards are a little bit warped and you don't have fancier machinery such as a joiner or planer. What we're going to be doing here is making panels, and a panel is just a term for a wide board that's made up of smaller boards. It's really about the only way that you can use solid lumber to get wide pieces. If you wanted a simpler method, you could just use plywood, but for this project, we're going with solid lumber. If you had a lot of clamps and a lot of patience, you could probably join these two long boards together to make one really long, wide board, but that's gonna be really challenging, especially if your board has a little bit of a bend in it. And as I'm looking at this board, I look down here, it's really that last foot or so that kind of bends. So I'll make sure I cut that off. So really the best way to handle this is to cut these down to smaller pieces and glue those together one panel at a time. In this case, I think it would be best if we cut these into 3 separate panels. I'm gonna make these cross cuts using my table saw. You could also use a miter saw. These aren't going to be exact cuts. These are gonna be oversized. So what I'm gonna do is cut each of these boards into 2 30-inch lengths and then a 20-inch length. Those will be used for the 2 sides of the box. So I won't be needing the rip fence. In fact, you really don't want it on your saw at all when you're making these cross cuts. So all I've done is I made a line at 30 inches. It's not exactly 30 inches, it's just somewhere near. Next, you need to remove your miter gauge and use your rip fence. So what we're gonna do is try to joint these boards. It's a matter of making sure that one side is perfectly flat so that one edge, so that when you glue them together, there's no gaps. There's a lot of different ways for making those straight edges on a board, but what I like to do on short boards like this is just use the rip fence itself. So as long as I can move this over, I'm just shaving off not even the thickness of the saw blade, just a little bit. And since this is a rip cut, you're gonna need to use either push sticks or a push block to keep your fingers out of the way of the blade. I don't ever recommend doing that. It just puts your fingers too close to the blade. So in this case, I'm gonna use my gripper here, and I just need to move this fence up and out of the way of the blade. Make sure that's not gonna hit. And I wanna keep the pressure on the board and pressed against the fence. So basically I've got 3 directions of pressure. I'm pushing forward, I'm pushing sideways, and I'm pushing down, all with this gripper. Assuming you've got your blade calibrated to be at a 90-degree angle to your table, you should have this nice squared off edge. So what I'm gonna do is just mark that with an X, just so I remember that's the jointed edge. This edge we'll just worry about later. Now you can take those jointed edges and put them together, and you should see that that seam is almost invisible. And you can play around with kind of different arrangements, however the grain looks best to you. In an ideal world, if you had a dedicated jointer and maybe a planer, you'd be able to pretty much make these dead on and glue them up. No fuss, no muss. But some of your boards might be a little bit warpy McWarp face here, and so you need to kind of work with them a little bit to get them to join together flat. This is also where you're going to find out that the more clamps you have, the better. When I'm joining boards together, I like to use pipe clamps. So what I can do is set them up on my workbench like this, and then I'll just kind of set this in here and see how that's going to work. About like that. That's going to give us pressure along that seam or that jointed edge, but we also want to make sure that the two boards are flush with each other so that one's not sticking up a little bit, and we have to deal with that later. So what I like to do is make just some scrap boards. These are called cawls, and I put some packing tape on them, just some plastic tape, just so glue doesn't stick to them. So then what we can do is, when we glue those two edges together, we can also clamp these boards together to make sure that they're flat, and I'll do those on both sides. So I'll just take you through this whole process. This is Titebond 2 yellow wood glue. I use it for just about everything. The important part about gluing together really anything is to make sure that that glue is spread over every bit of that surface, and on edges I just use my finger to spread this out. And you don't have to have a really thick layer, you know, one thin layer is fine. And I only put glue on one of the boards. So then once I have that in place, I can set this down in there, and what I'll do is bring these clamps together. And I'm not going to tighten them up completely right now. I'm just going to give them just until it starts to grab a little bit, right? About like that. You'll know you've got a good glue joint when you'll see the glue starting to squeeze out a little bit on that seam. So I can tell right here it's not flush, so this needs to come together, and that's why I need to use these cawls. It's possible, if your boards are pretty straight and pretty flat, that you can edge joint them together like this without using the cawls, just by pressing this together and then tightening these down. I can almost do that on this board, this panel here, but I want to use these cawls anyway. So again, I'm not getting these super tight right now, just getting this close. I'll use these clamps going this way. And same thing here, I don't want to tighten these down completely tight right now because I still want to apply more pressure going this way. So it's really sort of a balancing act. You just want to start tightening things equally all the way around. Okay, those are in place. Now I can start to tighten this down just a little bit. Again, you should start to see a little bead of glue squeezing out on that seam. If you find that the middle here isn't flush, you can add another cawl strip there. In fact, that's just what I'm going to do. Now I can start to cinch these down a little bit more. I'm just kind of working my way around. And just use your fingers to tell if it's flush. And you know, if it's a little bit off, it's okay, because we're going to sand this down anyways and smooth all of that out. But you know, you just want to reduce that amount of sanding as much as possible. You could probably stop here, but you know, if you have the clamps, it can't hurt to use them. And then it's also not a bad idea to put some clamps on the top side. Since these are on the underside pulling, these are on the top side pulling, it should kind of even out a little bit. You can tell I've got kind of like a real mishmash set of clamps that I've accumulated over the years. But really the pipe clamps, those first ones I used, are probably the handiest in this situation. The most important thing with clamping together anything is that you just do it until it stops, and then give it a little bit more. What you don't want to do is just really cinch these down, because that can cause problems, like the wood could slip apart, or it could actually cause the wood to bow a little bit. So just until it's I don't know, I guess kind of finger wrist tight, you might say. It's a good idea to look down this edge here and make sure that that is flat. You can set a straight edge on there, a level or something like that, just to make sure, but it does look pretty good. So there's the first panel. I'll let this dry at least an hour before I remove these clamps and move on to the next one. Working out a system of edge joining boards together is just one of the fundamental woodworking techniques that you really need to know if you're going to be using solid wood for projects. Typically, if I was going to glue up a panel this wide, I probably wouldn't even buy boards this wide. I would buy narrower boards and maybe glue together 3 of those rather than 2. But I thought, you know, if this is kind of your first project, it's probably going to be a little bit easier to glue together 2 at a time rather than 3. It'll be basically the same technique, but you just have that 3rd board to account for and make sure that everything is flat. Using these cauls will help immensely, even on boards that are slightly warped. I didn't intend for this segment to be so long, but I think this is a really important procedure to know how to do. Antonio, I'm looking forward to seeing how this works out for you and see if you have any questions or pitfalls that you encounter while you're joining those boards together. Also, I've included in the description kind of a preliminary set of plans. They're not quite complete yet, but it'll be useful to look at and kind of see where this is heading. I'll label it as version 1, and then as I make changes or if I encounter things that we need to change, I'll make sure to include the updated versions also. I know in my last video I mentioned that I was going to show you some of those Woodworking Summer Jam entries, but this video was just getting too long, so I'll save that for the next video. Man, there were some really good projects in there, so I'll be showing you those over the next few weeks also. And I've got some other stuff to show you in the next video while we're waiting for Antonio to start joining his boards together. I'm looking forward to seeing what his experience is like. That's it for now. I'll talk to you guys later.